Estamos aqui reunidos agora num evento muito memorável, um evento que literalmente vamos tratar de um tema que ainda é desconhecido no Brasil de uma forma acadêmica, científica, tal qual o nosso expositor o fará hoje. A gente vai falar sobre Memory Law, sobre leis da memória. E, na verdade, esse tema, ele tem o peso da história. Ele tem dentro de si tudo que é o nosso passado. O nosso tema trouxe aqui um título na escolha do nosso presidente do Fórum de Liberdade de Expressão, que é Ainda Estou Aqui, que na verdade é o título de um filme. Então, nós estamos aqui, um filme premiado, né, em que a nossa atriz Fernanda Torres recebeu aí premiações variadas, e Leis da Memória e a Política da Lembrança em Diferentes Continentes. Então, hoje, nós estamos aqui com uma jornada muito lúdica, uma jornada também muito científica e que não pode parar por aqui, não tem condição. Porque, dizendo agora para os nossos estudantes aqui da Escola da Magistratura do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, eu fui dar uma olhadinha, como acadêmica que sou, lá na produção intelectual constante do nosso expositor. E só na academia.edu eu encontrei disponível, acessível para todos, 67 textos de publicações científicas gratuitas e que tem cada qual um universo de peso intelectual. Então, nós estamos aqui com um grande expositor. E aí, eu queria, nessa abertura, lembrar também, senhoras e senhores, como integrante que sou do Fórum Permanente de Liberdade de Expressão da EMERJ e também vice-presidente do Fórum de Pós-Humanismo e Defesa dos Animais, Cláudio Cavalcante, que aqui na EMERJ a gente honra a memória, né? O Fórum Cláudio Cavalcante honra o legado de um ícone da dramaturgia nacional e o primeiro legislador brasileiro na lei de dignidade animal. Então, hoje eu tenho a enorme alegria de abrir a mesa dedicada a leis da memória. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a profound honor to speak here as a member of the Permanent Forum of Freedom of Expression at EMERJ and Vice President of the Permanent Forum of Post-Humanism and Animal Defense, a forum that honors in memory an actor, Cláudio Cavalcante, a monumental actor, and the first Brazilian legislator to legally recognize the dignity of animals. Eu falei um pouquinho aqui em inglês só para dar um sentido cozy aqui para o nosso palestrante, para que ele se sinta também acolhido, né? Então eu vou de vez em quando falar alguma coisa só para que ele se sinta também acolhido por nós. É com essa grande sensibilidade ampliada que recebemos hoje um dos maiores estudiosos do mundo em Memory Loss, o professor doutor Uladzislau Belavusau, é Senior Researcher em Direito Europeu no TMC Asser Institute. Então, a sua obra Law and Memory, por exemplo, eu tive que pegar uma, porque, na verdade, são inúmeras obras, inúmeros livros, mas Law and Memory Towards Legal Governance of History desafia estados a reconhecer suas feridas históricas. Para introduzi-lo, eu recorro ao cinema. Eu vou, na verdade, I will try to reach this memory by the sensitive file of humanity, esse arquivo sensível da humanidade, que é o cinema, porque estamos aqui com um texto de cinema. Então, comecemos aqui. É só uma abertura, tá, gente? É só um tom. Por Casablanca, 1942. You always have Paris. Nós sempre teremos Paris. Então, essa é uma frase típica, clássica de Casablanca, onde o passado nunca abandona, né? Assim como as responsabilidades históricas do direito e que o direito precisa enfrentar, né? Reminds us that the past never leaves us, right? So, outra lembrança, outra frase é It always about how we interpret the facts. É sempre como nós interpretamos os fatos. Essa é uma frase clássica de uma outra passagem cinematográfica, Doze Homens e uma Sentença. A verdade jurídica é construída e legislar sobre a memória é assumir essa construção. The film in English is Angry Man. It's always about how we interpret facts. Truth is always constructed. Então, assim, sobre essa construção da verdade e da memória que a gente vai falar. Outro tema importante tratado é em Blade Runner, porque a gente assim junta um pouco do pós-humanismo com as leis da memória, 1982, All those monuments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Todos esses momentos vão estar perdidos no tempo, assim como lágrimas se perdem na chuva. Memórias moldam identidades e leis de memória podem cristalizar narrativas oficiais. Memories shape identities and law. Então, assim, as memórias, elas formatam, seria mais a tradução literal, formatam as identidades. Life is harder than the movies. Então, a vida é mais dura do que os filmes, do que o cinema. E essa frase eu retirei. I did a spin-off this sentence of another movie, Cinema Paradiso, de 1988. Lembrar é um ato de cuidado com vítimas, com instituições e com o futuro. Cinema Paradiso whispers, remembering is an act of care. A lembrança é, acima de tudo, um ato de cuidado. Então, é com muito entusiasmo e profundo respeito que eu apresento o professor doutor Uladzislau Belavusau. Mas nós temos aqui, online conosco, o desembargador presidente do nosso fórum, desembargador André Gustavo Corrêa de Andrade, que é presidente do Fórum Permanente Liberdade, Expressão, Liberdades Fundamentais e Democracia da EMERJ, desembargador do nosso Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, é também membro do Fórum de Pós-Humanismo e Defesa dos Animais, Cláudio Cavalcante, por isso a menção que eu fiz, uma vez que nós dois somos co-docentes numa disciplina chamada Pós-Humanismo, no doutorado da Universidade Estácio de Sá, e professor deste programa de pós-graduação Stricto Sensu da Universidade Estácio de Sá, tanto no mestrado quanto no doutorado. Desembargador André, eu vou apenas fazer aqui uma referência ao nosso terceiro convidado aqui. Contei o senhor como convidado, olha que absurdo, o senhor é o host. Mas aqui também ao professor Fábio Carvalho Leite, membro do Fórum Permanente Liberdade de Expressão, Liberdades Fundamentais e Democracia da EMERJ, professor de Direito Constitucional e coordenador adjunto da pós-graduação em Teoria do Estado e Direito Constitucional da PUC-Rio e doutor em Direito Público pela UERJ. O professor Fábio Leite já esteve em outro evento com o professor Ulad, né? Eu tive a honra de poder assisti-lo, não presencialmente, mas online, e a gente só está dando continuidade. Esse é o segundo evento, acreditamos fortemente que o professor Ulad já faz parte da EMERJ e estará conosco em novos eventos em 2026. Desembargador André Gustavo Corrêa de Andrade, por favor.
Muito obrigado, professora Lúcia Frota. Primeiramente, bom dia a todas e todos. Eu queria, como presidente do Fórum Permanente de Liberdade de Expressão, Liberdades Fundamentais e Democracia da EMERJ, saudar especialmente o nosso convidado, o Dr. Uladzislau Belavusau, que é uma referência internacional no estudo das leis da memória e das políticas de lembrança. é um pesquisador, um acadêmico, um autor, como disse a professora Lúcia, fenomenal, e tenho o prazer de dizer que é um querido amigo. Queria cumprimentar e agradecer a presença também da professora Lúcia Frota, que é uma grande parceira acadêmica, que já mencionou que nós dividimos disciplina no doutorado da Universidade de Estácio de Sá, no tema do pós-humanismo e em outros temas também, como liberdade de expressão, liberdades fundamentais. E cumprimentar o professor Fábio Carvalho Leite, também pela participação nesta mesa. O professor Fábio também é um parceiro acadêmico, já de alguns anos, é um pesquisador importante no tema da liberdade de expressão, da liberdade religiosa, enfim, com vários trabalhos publicados. Eu tenho uma grande honra de poder participar junto com o professor Fábio Leite dessas pesquisas. Na verdade, ele lidera essas pesquisas e com as quais eu aprendo muito. Eu soube que o diretor-geral do EMERJ, o desembargador Cláudio Delor, virá daqui a pouquinho para se juntar a nós nesse evento tão importante. Ele, no momento, não está, porque ele está num outro evento aqui na Escola da Magistratura. Eu lembro bem disso, né? Como ex-diretor da Escola da Magistratura, como é que muitas vezes tinha que me desdobrar para participar de eventos simultâneos, acontecendo ao mesmo tempo aqui na escola. E essa é a função mesmo do diretor, né? De estar presente, de participar, de dar as boas-vindas e, sempre que possível, ter uma participação mais ativa e presente nos eventos da Escola da Magistratura. Bom, feitos os cumprimentos, eu queria hoje fazer uma menção. O encontro de hoje ele ocorre numa data simbólica. Hoje é o Dia Internacional dos Direitos Humanos. Exatamente em 10 de dezembro de 1948, as Nações Unidas aprovaram a Declaração Universal dos Direitos Humanos. Desde então, esse dia, 10 de dezembro, se tornou um marco global para reafirmar a dignidade humana, a igualdade e os fundamentos éticos e jurídicos das democracias contemporâneas. Então, eu acho bastante significativo que um debate sobre memória, responsabilidade histórica, aconteça exatamente nesta data, que ele acha uma coincidência. Quando marcamos o dia 10, por acaso, não foi pensando nessa data, mas vejam como é que essas coincidências muitas vezes são muito, muito interessantes, né? Então, é significativo que um debate sobre memória aconteça nessa data, porque, vejam bem, não há democracia sólida sem um compromisso contínuo de lembrar aquilo que não pode ser esquecido. E o tema que nós vamos discutir nessa manhã adquire, a meu ver, especial importância, relevância, diante do cenário político atual. O que nós vemos em diferentes países, o que observamos, é o fortalecimento, o crescimento de forças autoritárias que colocam em risco instituições democráticas, muitas vezes, frequentemente, por meio do apagamento ou do uso estratégico da memória histórica. Esses movimentos autoritários comumente manipulam narrativas do passado, relativizam fatos comprovados historicamente, difundem revisionismos convenientes e procuram transformar a história num instrumento de disputa política. Eu vejo isso como uma tendência global preocupante e que exige de nós vigilância constante. Esse contexto internacional dialoga diretamente com a realidade brasileira. Nosso país ainda enfrenta as consequências de uma tentativa recente de ruptura constitucional em que se atentou contra o Estado democrático de direito. A condenação de um ex-presidente da República e de outros envolvidos, inclusive militares, a meu ver, representou um passo institucional importantíssimo em defesa da democracia, porque demonstrou que o sistema de justiça no Brasil permanece ativo na defesa da ordem constitucional. Mas quero lembrar também acontecimentos recentíssimos, nesta madrugada, que evidenciam que as forças autoritárias continuam operantes dentro das próprias instituições que deveriam resguardar a democracia. A Câmara dos Deputados, depois de um evento em que houve um cerceamento da liberdade de imprensa, atos agressivos e violentos contra membros do parlamento, aprovou na calada da noite um projeto de lei que altera o cálculo das penas para crimes contra o Estado democrático de direito. Esse projeto de lei, se for convertido em lei, ainda vai ter um trâmite, ainda vai passar pelo Senado, eventualmente vai ter modificações, vai retornar para a Câmara, tem que ser sancionado, e, obviamente, isso tem que passar pelo crivo do Supremo Tribunal Federal. Mas, se isso for convertido em lei, isso poderá reduzir significativamente o tempo de prisão do ex-presidente, que foi condenado por tentar subverter o processo democrático. A meu ver, é uma iniciativa de caráter claramente casuístico e que sinaliza o quê? A disposição de determinados grupos de instrumentalizar o processo legislativo para favorecer interesses particulares. Então, o episódio, a meu ver, mostra que a ameaça à democracia não se limita a ataques externos ou explícitos, também se manifesta por dentro das instituições, quando estas deixam de atuar como garantidoras da legalidade republicana e passam a reproduzir agendas contrárias aos valores constitucionais. Pois bem, é nesse ambiente, precisamente, que a discussão sobre leis de memória se torna ainda mais necessária. A forma como uma sociedade lida com seu passado revela sua capacidade de enfrentar manipulações, resistir ao autoritarismo, consolidar consensos mínimos sobre fatos históricos essenciais. Por isso, a experiência europeia, que é objeto central da pesquisa do Dr. Uladzislau Belavusau, demonstra que essas leis podem proteger a dignidade das vítimas e preservar valores democráticos, mas, é importante que se diga, também podem ser utilizadas de forma abusiva para impor versões oficiais da história e limitar o debate público. O Brasil tem uma história marcada pela violência estatal e pela ausência de políticas sólidas de memória após a ditadura. E, por isso, o Brasil permanece vulnerável à manipulação do passado. Nós percebemos isso. E isso se intensifica em um ambiente digital em que a desinformação, tema que eu tenho estudado muito de perto, circula rapidamente. E isso alimenta revisionismos, negacionismos e nostalgias autoritárias. A disputa pela memória recente, especialmente em torno dos ataques ao Estado Democrático de Direito, demonstra que a história continua a ser um terreno aberto para conflitos políticos e não é um patrimônio consolidado da sociedade. Por isso que é papel da EMERJ, por meio deste fórum, oferecer um espaço de reflexão qualificado, de pensamento crítico. Nosso compromisso aqui na Escola de Magistratura é com a liberdade, os direitos fundamentais, com a democracia. É importante que se mencione que a memória não se limita à conservação do que ocorreu. A memória é importante porque ela organiza a identidade, ela orienta escolhas políticas e, sobretudo, ajuda a determinar os limites do que uma sociedade considera aceitável ou intolerável. Então, quando tratada com responsabilidade, a memória e as leis de memória fortalecem a democracia. Quando manipulada essa memória e as leis que tratam da memória, elas fragilizam a democracia e abrem caminho para retrocessos. Então, eu queria agradecer a presença de todos nesse evento importantíssimo e quero desejar que essa manhã seja uma manhã de debate que contribua para uma compreensão mais profunda dos desafios que nós enfrentamos, inúmeros, e das responsabilidades que recaem sobre cada um de nós na defesa da ordem democrática e dos direitos humanos.
Muito obrigada, desembargador André Andrade, pela aula, porque o senhor deu uma aula agora. Objetiva, mas foi uma aula. Inclusive, sempre com a atualidade absoluta dos temas, né? Muito obrigada. A gente podia desencadear a partir dessa fala até um outro evento, porque várias chaves de conceito o senhor trouxe aqui para nós. Eu vou passar a palavra agora, nesse momento, uma vez que nós dois, né, professor Fábio, somos debatedores aqui, eu passo imediatamente a palavra para o nosso palestrante, professor Uladzislau, para que inicie sua exposição.
Muito obrigado, professor Lúcia. De verdade prazer to Ainda estou aqui to be here, actually, yes, still being here, or like once again being here, rather, because this is at least the second or third time of me participating in the events at the School of Judges, and it's always not only an immense honor, but a true pleasure, also on the aesthetical level, on the level of the organization, to cooperate with people here, and of course to be in touch with all the wonderful colleagues and friends. Talking about wonderful colleagues and friends, of course, I'm so deeply attached that Professor Carvalho Leite, himself a wonderful specialist on hate speech and freedom of expression, is here once again with us. It's a pleasure to see you, and I hope that we could continue cooperation in the year to come, so to say. And last but not least, I cannot but express my gratitude. The genre demands of starting the presentation when you are abroad, right, to dear colleagues and friends, and of course, the dearest Andrade, who is not only an amazing scholar, again, of freedom of expression and hate speech, and that's how we first encountered a couple of years ago in the Netherlands. And since then, I've been always fascinated by enthusiasm, intellectualism, broad-mindedness of Andrade. It's a true pleasure and honor to know him, and I think he is the diamond of Rio de Janeiro, of the School de Magistratura, and yeah, for the years to come, I hope that we can only intensify our cooperation. Well, returning to our presentation today, yeah, Ainda, Estou, Aqui. And the movie and all the cultural references, bringing us a little bit away from criminal and constitutional law to a more fascinating level of perhaps law in humanities or law in society research. My previous intervention at the School of Judges last year mainly concerned with constitutions, with the phenomenon of mnemonic constitutionalism, so the idea that historical memory is present either very directly in the preambles of many legislative of basic laws of the countries, or sometimes even in constitutional discourses, so we can still position this phenomenon of mnemonic constitutionalism beyond the constitutional text. Today, I'm returning to the more traditional, by now, scope of memory laws, at least the way we know them from 2010s, when the subject has become popular in literature, foremost in the French literature, and by now it is well established, at least in the European context. I guess it's still very exotic for Brazil. So by memory loss, we usually understand diverse way we govern historical memory, usually on state level, sometimes interstate level. So there should be some legal element beyond just pure policy in administration in order to account for the scope of memory loss. So basically, this phenomenon describes the diverse ways law engages with historical memory. The major classification that you would encounter in literature is about dividing memory loss into punitive and non-punitive. So respectively, those memory loss or those modes of governance of historical memory that are enforcing, certain criminal responsibility. So in the European context, it's the classic Holocaust denialism clause that could lead from 3 to 5 years of imprisonment and then replicated for other historical events in diverse countries. And non-punitive memory loss. So this is something that exists in almost every country. The way we teach history at schools through ministerial decrees, the way we position the days of memory, the pantheon of our heroes and martyrs and important historical events through legislative assemblies, it's usually some sort of a soft memory law without punitive accountability. So if we deny heroism of a certain historical character that is portrayed by such a law, you're not necessarily going to prison. So this is the basic difference. And I think this punitivity is this devil in the detail why memory loss as the subject is still not that known to the Brazilian audience. Because strictly speaking, Brazil, as any country, does have memory loss. But it's mostly non-punitive memory loss. Even the whole spectrum of transitional justice as we know them in 2000, referencing the military dictatorship of the 70s, 80s, it all went through this amnesty law and then very soft report of the Truth Commission here, which basically went for a good or bad reason. Again, I'm not taking for this presentation any moral ethical stances. I'm just kind of analyzing the reality. And yes, Brazil technically belongs to the spectrum of countries that do not have the kind of denialism, trivialization law. So it's very hard to get to prison, to put it in the more colloquial language, for denying certain historical events. But that doesn't mean that Brazil doesn't have memory loss. And if we are getting into the mechanism of transitional justice in Brazil, which might be not that punitive as in the neighboring Argentina, or not that voluminous as somewhere in Colombia, it still operates heavily within the domain and parameters of what the scholars in Europe, recently in Asia, have been studying under the scope, under the heading of memory loss. So my subsequent presentation will be divided in several blocks. I will first guide you a little bit to the origins and genesis of memory loss as initially supposedly European phenomenon. So we'll talk about several countries in Western Europe. I will then shift towards Eastern Europe and demonstrate how, especially in the circumstances of the current Russo-Ukrainian war, the landscape of memory loss and the almost industrial production is heavily moving from Western Europe as being once the epicenter towards Central and Eastern Europe. Since our workshop today is about the global phenomenon of memory loss, I will also try to put in my presentation, albeit more briefly, China and South Korea as two examples from East Asia on the map of comparison. And if the time permits, I will talk very briefly about several countries in Latin America, including Brazil, about which I'm by no means an expert and I'm happily learning. So first thing first. I mentioned Holocaust denialism before, right? And actually most people who are acquainted with the subject in Europe, when they hear about memory loss, this is probably something that comes first to their mind. And in this way, Germany was pioneering. Surprisingly quite late, you would expect that Holocaust denialism is the phenomenon that would be prohibited somewhere in a criminal court and a special law already after World War II in Federal Republic of Germany, let's say in early 50s at least, right? And no. Actually, this is the later criminal imposition. It's the extension of hate speech clause, incitement to hatred, Volksverhetzung in Strafgesetz in the German criminal code. So basically the idea that hate speech should also encompass what back then was referred to as Auschwitz lie. Yeah, the discourses that were promulgated very actively in the 70s and in the 80s, denying either the number of the Holocaust victims, so saying it's not 6 million, but I don't know, 10 times less, or the methods of killing, or even outright denying the phenomenon of Buchenwald and Auschwitz and the persecution of the Jews in the Third Reich. So again, the technique was not to impose a new crime in Germany, but to extend hate speech legislation, incitement to hatred as a special spectrum, as a special scope towards the Holocaust denialism. But then it kind of opened the Pandora box for a good or bad reason. Because obviously it brings the question of comparability. If it's about Holocaust denialism, how about Ottoman Turkey and Armenian genocide? Yeah, that's the fact that it happened at the beginning of the 20th century and not 40 years ago, as if we were considering this in the 80s, 90s, right? Has a different amplification. Actually, the number of historical facts that we know about this Armenian genocide is quite unequivocal. So we could claim it. Hardly any scholar in the field of genocide studies these days wouldn't have classified Armenian genocide as such. Later in the 90s, of course, Rwanda brings the new nuances. How about recent events? Yeah, can Rwandan genocide be replicated, and the denial of it can be, But then let's not forget that it doesn't matter what country you're coming from, big or small, especially in Europe. But not only we are all growing up with the sensation that our countries all had had heroic past. We were only the victims and never the aggressors. And our neighbors usually owe us something, also historically, in terms of bringing historical justice, and that has certain ramifications also for the way we are treating minorities. So obviously the 90s, 2000s, after this Holocaust denialism has been introduced, saw the promulgation and importation of the idea. So for all sort of victimhood or perceived victimhood in the social memory, we should claim a memory law. But those were not Germans who coined the term memory law. In fact, those were French historians in the 2010s who actively applied this term when French first replicated this German model, as by the way, almost all of the continental Europe and now also on the level of the EU, Holocaust denialism should be prohibited in terms of the Council decision of 2008 on xenophobic and racist speech. But France went a step further. So apart from La Loi Guesson, which also introduced a similar clause for Holocaust denialism, the amplification was the so-called Loi Taubira of 2001, which was brought by social MP back then into the parliament with the idea that France should acknowledge its colonial past. And not just colonial past as an abstract idea, because also hardly anyone in France denies this. It's the matter of the interpretation, but the fact that France was the slavery empire, and it probably owes something to the descendants of the slaves, and as the bare minimum should acknowledge its very notorious role in slave trade. Initially, when it came to the parliament, the idea was let's replicate straightforward Loi Guesson or Holocaust denialism, right? And let's impose something like the denial of colonial or slavery, past slavery as the crime against humanity in France should also lead to 3 to 5 years of imprisonment, like we have for the Holocaust. That idea was rejected already in the parliament, interestingly, back then, because the parliamentarians saw that it will reopen the Pandora box of cascade, of the historical injustices, and will bring to the constitutional implications. And yet that law wasn't uncontested, because even though there was technically no punitive factor, and technically it was non-punitive, like those, soft legislation in Brazil, but it was something more. It was about not just saying that we need to celebrate the day, I don't know, somebody reached the Guanabara Bay in Rio de Janeiro as the national holiday, right? Not like that. It was about distinctly outlining the crime in trade of slavery, even historically, retrospectively, because obviously France is the party to all the convention prohibiting slave trade, but retrospectively. And that brought to an interesting contestation in courts. Even despite there was no punitive element like in the Holocaust denial cases, still there were several attempts to bring cases against the historians, including most famous historians of colonialism back then, who were telling, wait a minute, but you are taking things anachronistically. In terms of the victimhood, you're portraying victimhood as very binary, so whites and the blacks, while the biggest trade owners in the region were actually Arabs and later Ottoman Turks. This is one thing. Second, this apology may not deliver even the justice it promises to deliver, and it may not make sense in this anachronistic settings, because then should Greeks apologize for all the slavery they brought to Phoenicians? How absurdly back you can interpret it. So in all that discussion, obviously, was uncomfortable. At one spectrum, it was seen as completely racist. At other spectrum, it was just seen as rational, and in bringing some comparators there and trying to rationalize the discourse. But what is important is that there were attempts in the courts to prosecute those historians. So the idea was, even if there is no punitive element, this law should be interpreted by analogy with Loi Guesson, so Holocaust denialism. Well, the court didn't go as far as to find them comparable. So in fact, obviously those cases were brought as the matter of freedom of expression. So what prevails kind of a hate speech, genocide denialism as part of hate speech back then. This terminology back then wasn't very established. By the way, hate speech as a term in Europe wasn't that implied. It is a clear Americanism. Europeans were comfortable with something like incitation à haine, the incitement of hatred, Volksverhetzungen, just incitement against the population. So I guess in most Romance languages, including Portuguese, it's also not exactly discurso de odio, right? It's this newer term that appears as transplanted from American constitutional writings. And then there were attempts to basically get out of this, and the parliament tried to repeal the law, not very successfully, but it became even more scandalous when the right-wing parties brought a very analogous law, but requiring the state to recognize the positive role, mission civilisatrice, of the French colonization in North Africa. So you see, although it looks very progressive from the spectrum of slavery and colonial discussion, the subject of memory loss, it's actually a rotating base guillotine. It's just a matter of who is in power, on the right or on the left, and who will bring the legislation there. Because a very similar loi Mercachère to loi TJRJ, the aforementioned law on colonial slavery, was brought in recognition of the positive role of slavery. You see almost absurdly opposite. And the necessity to teach those lessons of positive French colonialism in the French schools. And in that point, there was a huge mobilization of historians who started the movement, which was called Liberté pour l'Histoire, liberty, freedom for history. And in their mobilization, they published several important pamphlets, so to say, in the major newspapers like Le Monde. Back then, all the major historians and sociologists of history like Assmann, Pierre Nora, who passed away this year. For those of you who might be interested in memory studies, this is basically the author of the whole concept of the lieu de mémoire, the places of memory, and absolutely foundational person for not only for history, but also for the politics of history. So they all, both French, Italians, Germans, Timothy Snyder back then, now a renowned American historian, they all signed this manifesto. And for the first time, they started using in this discourse in Le Monde this term, la loi mémorielle, in addressing both the Holocaust denialism provisions and follow-up provisions on both negative and positive role of colonialism. In the meantime, there was also an attempt to promulgate the same law about Armenian genocide denialism with a punitive measure. And I think this is where it went to the degree that both the Parliament and Le Conseil Constitutionnel, the judges at the Constitutional Court Tribunal in France, started understanding that they are opening this Pandora box. The competition of victimhood, the competition of criminalization, and even declarative memory loss are not necessarily entirely non-problematic. One useful classification that could help us rationalize those memory loss that was brought later, in fact, in the past 5 years, is looking into memory loss not only as punitive and non-punitive, but also as self-inculpatory and self-exculpatory. I know it sounds terrible both in English and probably as translated in Portuguese not much better. So the idea is that some nations or governments or state or group of nations are voluntarily taking the guilt through those memory legislations. And the eminent example here is, of course, Germany. That's why it has been always a foundational country study for the memory politics, right? So the idea that we Germans, we committed terrible crimes against our Jewish neighbors, and we annihilated effectively 6 million of Jews from the European space. And there are those self-exculpatory memory laws, right? So Mercachère law about this delegation of the guilt and rather the acknowledgement of the positive role of French slavery can then be regarded as this self-exculpatory memory law. Returning to the examples of self-inculpatory memory laws that might be important for this post-Iberian, I would say also Spanish and Portuguese space, including post-colonial space and wider globalization of the Portuguese and Spanish languages and legal systems, belongs to Spain itself, because Spain has been the country that not only imposed something that they directly called la ley de memoria histórica, because neither la loi Guesson, nor loi Taubira, nor Holocaust denialism clauses in Germany or replicated throughout Europe has never been referred to by those countries as memory laws. As I mentioned to you, it was the historians who used this term, in their protest and saying, stop, you're going further for the good or bad reasons, even with the Holocaust, we are kind of agreeing, but still you're pushing it too far. But Spain was the first country that introduced the law and called it la ley de la memoria histórica, the law about historical memory, and that was about Francoist memory. It was a soft memory law, non-punitive. It's hard to position it in terms of delegating or exculpating guilt, because it was already the democratic government that imposes this. Later, this law has been replicated in Spain, at least in Mexico, at least on the level of Ciudad de Mexico. I suspect that it has heavily influenced also the discourse of what has been going on in Argentina, neighboring to Brazil, in terms of post-transition. But also there was an important law on the level of citizenship, just to show you that memory laws are not necessarily about declaration about memory or some criminalization about memory. Spaniards also imposed several laws about recognizing citizenship to the descendants of the Sephardic Jews that were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula by the medieval kings in the 16th century. As basically the easy way of naturalization for them. A similar law was also introduced back then in Portugal. And although those laws are technically citizenship laws, right? They kind of introducing us an interesting memory component, because the way we know citizenship from constitutional law is always about jus sangue or jus sale, right? So either you're born in the country or your parents belong to the country and therefore you belong to that citizenship line. They introduced something more. It's not even naturalization per se when you are living a certain number of years in a country, fulfilling the requirements of the language and, naturally getting naturalized. It's kind of the idea of a rupture. No. You were the citizen because your ancestors were illegally removed. So the idea was probably taken from Austrians and Germans, and because the Third Reich also expelled through Nuremberg laws the Jews from citizenship, not only, prosecuted and effectively killed them, but it also brings a very interesting idea that memory laws these days are not necessarily criminal, are not necessarily semi-constitutional, but very often it's an interesting melange of educational policies, protection of cultural heritage, and this mentioning lieux de mémoire, the places of memory, and Pierre Nora, but also citizenship. And Spanish example, which I suspect would be increasingly more referential for Latin America in general, can be characterized by mostly non-punitive memory laws of declaratory character and also self-inculpatory rather than self-exculpatory. However, something interesting happens around 2010s, when the epicenter of production of memory laws moves from Western Europe towards Central and Eastern Europe. Decommunization in the 90s, 2000s went further than recognizing in certain countries, let's say, the prohibition of communist symbols on par with the Nazi symbols, and by the way, far from all the post-communist countries, just in several of them. Of course, the discussions on lustration, whether certain collaborators with the communist regime should be removed from the office or not, but it kind of stayed within the parameters of the memory politics that has been crafted by Germans, I would say, with the inculpatory idea about the Holocaust, and also the EU has heavily promulgated the Holocaust memory as the foundational for the European reunification. But in 2010, something starts happening, and I suspect that it has something to do with Russians back then already manufacturing through mass propaganda of both hatred to Ukrainians and the revival of pan-Slavism, the revival of the imperial ideas, which are very, very well resonated with colonial ideas, and the also here in Latin America. And both Russia and Ukraine are engaging in the competition on memory loss, especially around 2014-2015 with the occupation of Donbass and annexation of Crimea. Russia promulgates the law on the denazification. So that's how it is called in as the criminal provision. The idea that any that's saying that denying the positive role, of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, which in the Russian setting is called Great Patriotic War, and which chronologically is treated differently than in the rest of the world, not to acknowledge the Polish occupation of 1939. Russians started their Great Patriotic War from 1941, which is also an important element of memory politics. So the denial of the positive role of the Soviet liberation of Central Eastern Europe, in particular, could lead to criminal sentences of 3-5 years. Again, kind of looking into Holocaust clauses and bringing them for the instrumentalization of the current politics. Ukrainians, in contrast, start using memory loss as a shield. You would expect decommunization in Ukraine would happen in the 90s, 2000s, and yet decommunization loss is the phenomenon of 2015. So back then, the Ukrainian memory policies were more centered on the idea of recognizing the Holodomor, the mass starvation of Ukrainians by Bolsheviks in the 30s, rather than about decommunization. Those laws were quite controversial, although most of them were, unlike Russian memory laws, non-punitive. Only one of them about symbols was, communist symbols was with the criminal punishment. And yet, amongst the Western historians, there was a very heavy criticism, which perhaps these days won't even happen because Ukraine is the victim of the Russian aggression. But back then, even though, despite the occupation and annexation, etc., still Ukraine was very often disciplined for good or bad reasons, by the leading historians and scholars in memory politics, and said, like, you are not better than Russians. You're promulgating this aggressive memory politics. Ukrainians were saying we're using it as a shield, and we are promulgating what you Europeans are doing basically for all those years since the end of the 80s. Well, interestingly enough, the EU politics of memory, which also had a couple of memory laws on the EU level. For example, the aforementioned Council decision of 2008, which was which was making all member states of the European Union to criminalize technically genocide denial. It wasn't mentioning Holocaust per se, but effectively it should have led to the criminalization of Holocaust denialism in the member states. If we look into the discourses of what has been said in the annual speeches in the Commission and the EU Parliament, it has been always, the communist heritage has been always the uncomfortable cluster, especially for the left wing in peace, right? And for the many Central and West Eastern European countries, that was a heavy claim. Like, our victimhood is not recognized. You should guys put it on par with the, the victims of the Gulag, with the victims of the, let's say, with the Jews or other categories prosecuted by the Nazis. But yet the discourse back then in the European Parliament and the number of those soft memory laws, mostly declarations by the Parliament, like recognition of Armenian genocide, recognition of Holodomor in Ukraine, has been still more centered on the memorization of World War II. After the fully fledged invasion into Ukraine in February 2022, things start changing. Obviously, both Russia and Ukraine both are intensifying memory loss, and in Russia with heavily criminal proceedings, and actually with quite a lot of people being imprisoned under the allegation of denial of the positive role of the Soviets, or the so-called efforts to denazify. In Ukraine, there was a shift from not only decommunization laws, but also treating this whole Russian heritage as Ukraine as colonial. So there's a shift towards decolonization through memory laws, both through mostly non-punitive memory laws, but still quite happy, and the discourse about renaming the streets, monuments, impositions, etc., is very heavily promulgated. And the most recent memory law in Ukraine of 2025 introduces almost funny term. I don't want to sound any pejorative, it just does sound funny, also in Slavic languages, Russism, as trying kind of to merge fascism and the Russian ideology of imperialism during this Russo-Ukrainian war in Ukraine. And well, taking the moment, I wanted also to draw the attention of some of you who might be interested in memory politics or in Russo-Ukrainian war that is ongoing now. Recently, with a couple of colleagues of mine, Maria Maltso, Angelika Newsberger, who herself is the former vice president of the European Court of Human Rights, of the judge from Germany at the European Court of Human Rights, Alexandra Glishchinska-Grabes, we did an edited volume about memory loss, in particular in the context of Russo-Ukrainian war. So it has 4 clusters, obviously chapters on Russia, chapters on Ukraine, but also chapters on the neighboring countries, showing how Hungary and Poland were heavily engaged in the production of memory loss on different levels, and how the troubled relations with both Ukrainians and Russians, which are not that easy if you're looking from a side, because the crystal story is that Poland supports Ukraine, no, full stop. Actually, the Ukrainian-Polish relations has been historically not less complicated than Russian-Polish relations themselves. Also countries like the major satellite of Russia in that war, through which the aggression to Ukraine was made, Belarus is mentioned, countries like Finland are analyzed. But the book also analyzes in its fourth part the European policies on the level of the Council of Europe and the level of the European Union. And the book very clearly shows the shift of the paradigm on the European level, in kind of trying for the first time to put the communist crimes and the crimes of Russian imperialism a bit on par with the history of World War II. And that also tells us about the identity production and crafting of the Europeanness, also what actually makes Europe beyond free movement of goods, services, right? What's actually in common between Swedes and Maltese, Poles, and Irish, right? Apart from all of those countries at certain times being engaged in torturing their Jewish population. This is, if we primitivize it and take it from ghettos, this would be the major discourse of the European Union, as we know it since the Maastricht Treaties in the 90s. So these days, this policy is very much about Ukraine, and Russia and Ukraine are perhaps the epicenter of memory loss production themselves. Very briefly, I wanted to mention something beyond Europe. Well, most countries in East Asia, despite very complicated and in many ways similar, but in other ways also different attitude and towards World War II, and also the peculiar place of Japan in those settings, and in both Korea and China, in complicated subjects like, let's say, comfort women and from China and from Korea in Japan. But for me, that was interesting that those countries that for many years have preserved a certain taboo on legislating memory. So all those discourses, let's say, discussions about comfort women in Japan, or celebrations, which is very uncomfortable for the East Asians from Indonesia to Korea, in a certain temple, in Kyoto, in Japan for the military criminals, from the perspective, of course, of the countries that the Japanese been attacking in the World War II. Those discourses have never moved much further than political diplomacy, right? And yet the transitional justice, at least in one country, has been so sophisticated, and that country is South Korea. I think it's one of the most interesting cases of transitional justice I've encountered. If Brazil had one truth commission, very short-lived, and with one report of which everybody's proud, Korea had more than 30 different smaller truth commissions. And we are talking not only about the tragic history and the reconstruction of history with Japan, considering that throughout 20th century, the peninsula was under Japanese occupation. Of course, they were with North Korea and the division on the parallel. But also, let's not forget that South Korea itself, the Republic of Korea, has been effectively until the 80s a dictatorship, right-wing dictatorship. At certain periods of its history, also military dictatorship, much like Brazil throughout its history. And it also had the episodes of atrocities, which are comparable to something that has happened in Chile or in Argentina, let's say, with mass killings in the town of Guangzhou in May 1918. The episode that I think awaits its own Ainda, Estou, Aqui for East Asia. And for me, it was very symbolic that the most recent Nobel Prize winner for literature, a Korean lady, Korean writer, she comes from Gwangju, and for her, this is one of the central themes, talking about this law in humanities and how humanities are reintroducing as the subjects that are substantially legal. So why Korea is also important beyond the sophisticated mechanism of transitional justice is because apart from declaratory memory laws, which are obviously present in almost every member state, Korea also replicated this Holocaust denials, but not for the Holocaust, which is non-subject in East Asia at all, but for the Gwangju uprising. So the denial of Gwangju uprising can also lead to 3 years of imprisonment since 2021 by special law. And this is an interesting development when an East Asian country replicates essentially Western mode of governing historical memory, introducing punitive memory law, right? Self-inculpatory for the state, but it also brings the example of how this technique of memory laws is spreading. And what's interesting, each time I'm talking to Korean colleagues, they don't see controversies there. So they look into exclusively positive effects of this legislation without understanding that legislation inevitably also opens the Pandora box for the replication of victimhood and attempts to bring similar legislations for other episodes. Well, there is also a very sophisticated and interesting mechanism of transitional justice in Taiwan, but I will skip it for the sake of the elephant in the room, which is China in the region, obviously. And the Communist China recently has been also engaged in the business of adopting memory laws. Some of them even punitive, although the vast majority are declaratory. And I find it completely fascinating because the Chinese version of memory loss is also very heavily about World War II, but it integrates these elements of East Asian piety, almost Confucian idea of hierarchies, and the idea of martyrs and heroes. So 2018 Chinese memory law is about recognizing the pantheon of those who fought heroically for the motherland and died, and they are having the status of heroes and martyrs. Later on, in 2021, there was the law which brought criminal punishment for the defamation of those heroes and martyrs, so protecting effectively their dignity. For me, they are interesting because the first intuition that, of course, this is kind of the state ideological crafting on we are the best and we only suffered. And so this, because we all learn in school, right, about our countries. Everybody is bad and our ancestors were the saints and or the victims or the heroes, nothing else matters. And you are kind of encouraged directly or indirectly to die for your motherland, right? But unlike the European memory laws, and that makes for me the Chinese case absolutely fascinating, European memory laws has been crafting this, idea that we know from the 18th century when Louvre was imposed and was supposed to be after La Prise de la Bastille, after the French Revolution, this idea that we're taking everything from the feudals, we're putting them into museums, and we're exposing national glory because we need to shape the French citizens, right? Citizenship and memory are always the twins that need to go together because that's how we are raising this awareness, this duty of citizenship. And the European discourses on memory laws, when you're reading, it's all about translating a certain historical crafting. It's about a certain version of history, and it's about creating citizenship. So in the Chinese version, actually, when you're reading those laws and in translation or analyzed by my sinologist colleagues, you actually realize something very weird, that they do not translate a specific historical interpretation. And China itself has a bit of a, I won't say schizophrenic, but at least a very sui generis, for lawyers, a very convenient term version of history where, China sort of exists from 5,000 years, and the older civilization, all the rest are, of course, the barbarians. In this way, they are not much different from mission civilisatrice that we know from the French in the 19th century. But there is no kind of idea that, this is the Chinese version, let's say, of the World War II is the only right version. It's more about creating this idea that, dying, there is something noble about dying for your motherland. And lots of those laws are an interesting conversion, which we don't see much in Europe, or at least very rarely with welfare. Because those who are veterans or the survived martyrs and heroes, and their descendants are having certain privileges, social privileges, right? Certain pensions, the social entitlements. So it's almost like Latin American version of looking into social rights as being at the epicenter of the constitutionalism. And another very particular, if not peculiar, side of the Chinese memory loss is digitalization. So Chinese go as far as to create the digital pantheon of heroes and martyrs, visualized. So some of that visualization looks kind of creepy. Again, let's use the word sui generis not to get into the colloquialisms. But we don't find it that maybe with the level of the artificial intelligence and the new way of surrealism in Latin America and Europe, we will also come to this digital space of memory and this replication of ancestral piety. But this mixture of digitalization, Confucianism, and basically communist almost Maoist interpretation of history is super interesting. And furthermore, Chinese also borrowed something from Europe, namely nihilism, which technically it's nihilism. It's a Nietzschean idea that the God that is that, therefore we are all lonely in this world, and it's not about denialism. It's about this sense of non-belonging that leads to certain behaviors. Well, Chinese kind of borrowed it through Russians' interpretations in the 20s because it was heavily used in the Bolsheviks' writings. And all of the denialism, for example, of martyrs as heroes is about promulgating this idea of the harms of nihilism. Which is, again, absolutely fascinating phenomenon that we certainly don't encounter that often in Latin America. Talking about Latin America, of which I'm by no means a specialist, but a huge enthusiast, trying to recently, engage also into literature, Lusophone literature and El Mundo Hispanohablante. And what I find fascinating about this space is that expectedly, memory loss here are very well, almost inseparable from the transitional justice. With the juntas in Chile, the military dictatorship in Argentina in the 70s, 80s, almost the same period with 4 years difference here in Brazil. Expectedly, the biggest centers of production of soft memory laws, this declaratory memory laws, are those truth commissions, either through the extended reports or the accompanying documentation. It remains speculative and not very well established in literature to which degree amnesty laws should be treated as memory laws themselves. So the idea that let's kind of stabilize the past and agree to disagree for, in order to move forward. And the diverse versions with in how the countries are dealing with this absolute contrast between Brazil and Argentina in 2000. This is quite remarkable, which to a certain degree might be also attributed to the number of victims, which is not exactly comparable in Brazil and in Argentina. And probably before Ainda, Estou, Aqui, in the last 20 years, Brazil as the subject of transitional justice was less known, I would say, especially for the comparative scholars. But again, this movement, I would say, cultural initiatives, and this is extremely important movie of the past year with the Oscar, is bringing Brazil back and showing that something has been going on here. I find it extremely symbolic also for the work I'm doing and the engagement with colleagues all over the world who are engaged in the legal studies of historical memory. is that the main character of that movie pursues, after the tragic events, pursues the academic legal career, you know, in her hope to reconstruct, you know, with what in Argentina or Chile will be called probably justicia verdad, justicia verdade, yeah, something like this in Portuguese. So the idea that truth needs to be reconstructed, either through very sophisticated and meticulous archival work or contestations in the court, or both. And that also leads us back to the stream of memory loss, and actually to my conclusions that what we are observing is the movement of what I call movement from memory loss per se, this loi mémorielle in France. Let's say, I don't know, Armenian genocide happened, and if you deny this, you know, you're committing a crime and you need to go to prison, into the space of constitutionalization. So in many countries, we see it purely in the constitution, especially post-colonial and transitional level, with very fascinating preambles that expectedly portray the heroic past of our ancestry, right? And the constitutional courts are supposed to treat that past as the signal of interpretation for the future. So it's not a stagnant mechanism, but something that the judges are supposed to use in their interpretation of the future. In this way, the Fidesz constitution of 2010 in Hungary is very representative, because not only it recognizes the Hungarians, the nation that fought for Christian civilization since the medieval ages and has been always heroic and pure, but underwent communist and Nazi occupations, and therefore those constitutions are illegal. But where was the preservation of the heart of Hungarian constitutionalism? The crown of Saint Stephen. So some medieval king and his crown that is symbolically brought to the parliament of Hungary, and the idea that, you know, this in the country which is secular, which is which is parliamentary republic, and effectively not a monarchy, this monarchical symbol is the preservance of the constitutional legality. In a similar way, the Netherlands, after 20 years, you know, of considering whether they should replicate Loi Taubira about slavery past, considering that along with Spain, Portugal, and France, that was the biggest colonizing power. Actually, even here in Brazil, on the north, for a very short time, it didn't choose to pursue the French way of legalizing memory through a memory law of the parliamental level, partially because it would be more complicated than in France, because the Kingdom of the Netherlands is more than just the Netherlands. It also includes the Caribbean lands that are countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, such as Aruba, Curacao. And technically, it raises a big question whether they have to be consulted as well. Can just the Dutch Parliament in The Hague, you know, bring this, promulgate this law, or those countries needs to be engaged in its negotiation? And obviously, it will get into the uncomfortable issues like compensations, restitutions, and financial negotiations of those countries for that might not even be necessarily dealing with historical events, but with pure contestations of budget within the kingdom. So the Netherlands chose an alternative way. The apologies first of the prime minister in 2021, followed by the apology of the king, recognizing not only the crime of this of slavery retrospectively, but also the role of the royal family itself, and you know, imposing a very important budgetary means for pursuing that research. I think that soon there will be a museum, and this is now a technique of almost diplomacy for the Netherlands. Recent visit of our king, His Majesty in Suriname, started with the official apology once again to the Surinamese people, who are these days not even the part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, right? And then acceptance of the apology on behalf of Suriname from some bureaucrat, respectively. And it's kind of getting into the new degree of diplomacy, you know, where in order to, you know, to interact to colonial subject in legal terms, need to bring either very legislative or something very symbolic, which again brings me to the idea that in order to promulgate mnemonic constitutionalism, you don't need memory law, you do not need even to change the constitution. If you think about those symbolic actions of the king or this crown of Saint Stephen, or if we're returning to my Spanish and Portuguese examples of giving back citizenship to the descendants of the Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Iberian Peninsula in the 16th century, retrospectively, and citizenship is the subject that we all learn in constitutional classes. This leads us to the to the proof that the tectonic changes are, in terms of memory, are getting not only through the specific laws that can be claimed as memory laws, and it's very hard to define what belongs to this cluster anyway, but on this constitutional level. My second conclusion is that this contestation and this tectonic shift towards constitutional sphere also leads us to a new way of diplomacy, where both for manufacturing new wars, you kind of need history as the epicenter of the justification. I mean, if you will follow Putin's interviews in the last 2 years, and all the journalists from the right, from the left, from the center asking him, so what are the rationales to attack the independent neighboring state? And basically there are two, and one is completely ephemeral, the NATO, right? But then Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania have been already the part of the on the right on the border with Russia and parts of the NATO, and the supposed accession of Ukraine to the NATO is the existential danger for Russia. And the second one is about this reinventing this imperial Russian myth about non-existent of Ukrainians as the nations, as being some form of sub-Russian, which is also backed up by the media propaganda domestically, in order to both explain the raison d'etre for the war for its own citizens, but also externally for the Western and non-Western audiences alike. And then certain countries that feel the need to defend themselves, foremost Ukraine in that case, but also neighboring Poland, Baltic states, etc. So everybody in that region is trying to bring certain memory loss, albeit of non-punitive character, symbolically as a shield, but also putting alliances. China using World War II as the alliance breach with Russia, and remembering how important 9th of May parades are for Russia. Participating in them, bringing Russians for the analogous parade in China. This kind of soft diplomacy with Serbia, this kind of solidarizing with the Serbia's interpretation of NATO bombardments in Yugoslavia, and this level of Chinese diplomacy is absolutely fascinating. And sometimes this level of diplomacy is also populated by the mnemonic mechanism that can be called memory loss. So to finish this presentation, Ainda, Estou, Aqui. I hope that it's not the last time that I'm Estou Aqui, because Brazilian case is absolutely fascinating. I think it's very understudied. And in this plethora of memory legislation, mnemonic policies, because it's so rich on so many levels. I mean, I didn't even touch subjects like I don't know, colonialism, for example, right? So even if we are talking just about military dictatorship of the 20th century, it is already so fascinating. It definitely waits for many voluminous monographs and comparative research. And for those of you interested in this, I encourage you to keep in touch. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Uladzislau. It was amazing to hear you. Foi maravilhoso ouvir o senhor professor Uladzislau. Foi muito bom, inclusive porque nós estamos muito longe dessa visão globalizada, porque geograficamente o Brasil está, we are very far away from Europe, e é muito, é uma forma de oxigenar os nossos estudos, a gente se aproximar de todo esse historicismo que é a história da nossa humanidade. I took some notes, some quick notes here, I just like pointed. Eu vou passar a palavra para o nosso debatedor, professor Fábio Leite. Eu tenho apenas uma pergunta, mas vou deixar para o final, mas tomei algumas notas aqui, só de bullet points aqui, para a gente poder, eventualmente, fazer outros eventos, continuar nessa discussão, keep going on this track, because it's very nice for us to learn from you, and é muito importante para a gente, muito bom a gente aprender através do professor Uladzislau, e a gente também desenvolver and develop here our memory loss, because we still don't have it. So, desenvolver nossas leis de memória, uma vez que a gente ainda não as tem. E eu anotei algumas coisas, por exemplo, it's hard to go to prison for denying a historical event here in Brazil. Realmente é uma situação que a gente vê que é muito difícil ir para a prisão por negar um evento histórico no Brasil. Então, assim, esse negacionismo é algo que o desembargador André, Gustavo Corrêa de Andrade, trabalha muito nas aulas dele, nas obras dele, nos textos dele, e os eventos históricos, eles realmente merecem ter um palanque maior na nossa atualidade. A gente precisa aprender com a nossa história. O professor Ulad também falou de Pandora Box of Victimhood of Past, né? Então, aquelas vítimas do passado, quando se abrir a caixa de Pandora, elas vão literalmente vir à tona, e é algo que a gente muitas vezes, ou talvez sempre, coloque para baixo do tapete. Então, está na hora da gente pensar a respeito disso. O Global Phenomenon of Memory Law. Então, é um fenômeno global que o Brasil tem que se aproximar. O Brasil tem que se integrar, na verdade, né? E uma frase que eu não vejo muito aqui no Brasil: you are encouraged to die for your motherland. A gente não tem esse patriotismo, que é algo emocionante, às vezes, não sei, é um tema para provocação. It's very provocative here in Brazil. So, a gente pode pensar em discutir isso futuramente. E ainda no Brasil, a gente tem que falar de slavery, né? Distinguish the crime of slavery and aspects of racism, aspectos do racismo e a escravidão, porque, na verdade, essa é a nossa história. A gente acabou de ganhar um prêmio aqui no Tribunal de Justiça do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, professor Ulad, por causa da trilha da memória. A gente tem uma servidora aqui, a Tatiana, que ela é historiadora também, é nossa professora na Escola de Administração Judiciária, e ela faz um curso que é uma visita em pontos aqui do Rio de Janeiro, bem próximos aqui. Eu ainda não fiz a trilha da memória, estou louca para fazer, para conhecer, em que ela traz muito da questão da slavery, da escravidão, do colonialismo, que está aqui marcado próximo da gente geograficamente. E acabamos de ganhar um prêmio no nosso tribunal por causa dessa junção acadêmica que ela faz através de uma trilha da memória. A History of Colonialism and o modelo que o senhor trouxe, the French Colonialism, e a gente tem que falar também do nosso colonialismo aqui no Brasil. Not punitive value, não temos realmente valores punitivos aqui para as nossas ideias, que não são exatamente leis de memória, mas comissão da verdade, e, assim, ideias que, na verdade, não têm tanto esse valor punitivo. E eu queria também trazer, na verdade, um tema que, fazendo pesquisa a respeito da obra do senhor, eu me deparei com um termo que eu acho que poderia ser um evento, que é o termo democracy. Se a gente for traduzir para o português, seria memocracia. Memocracia. Olha que interessante. E aí, esse projeto, ele traz o desafio das políticas populistas da memória para a Europa, rumo a respostas eficazes à legislação militante sobre o passado. E o termo vem definido como ruling on the basis of memory, ou seja, governar com base na memória. Governar com base na memória. será que a gente faz isso? Eu acho que a gente não faz isso aqui no Brasil, mas é interessante demais. Então, existe um projeto. E por que esse projeto está tomando uma dimensão tão forte? Porque na Europa, que tem um passado muito mais extenso que o nosso, nós somos jovens aqui no Brasil, né? Nós somos um país jovem em relação à Europa. Existe uma cultural war, uma guerra cultural contemporânea, porque são exatamente os pontos que o professor Ulad falou a respeito das versões culturais. Quem é que narra? Quem é que conta? Quem é que pode ser lembrado? Qual a versão que vai valer? Qual a que vai permanecer? E aí a gente vai chegar no nosso poder judiciário, na mesa do juiz. Quando o juiz ele profere uma sentença, ele está dando razão a uma das partes, a não ser que seja sucumbência recíproca, mas ele vai estar dando razão a uma das partes, e ele vai estar eternizando alguma versão. Olha que importante isso, né? Então, o papel do Poder Judiciário também é um papel de extrema responsabilidade, já que nós estamos aqui na casa do juiz, né? E o senhor falou na Chinese version, e aí eu penso também assim, em cada país, cada country version. A gente, aqui no Brasil, a gente está um pouco isolado, então a nossa versão não tem tanto diálogo. A gente sente falta do diálogo habermasiano aí. E aí eu gostei muito quando o senhor mencionou as Comfort Women, né? Porque eu tenho um curso aqui que eu montei, eu sou professora de Direitos Humanos, e que eu trouxe o elemento das Comfort Women e os alunos nossos aqui não conheciam, porque we are very far away from that. Então, assim, nós estamos muito longe disso na história e geograficamente, e eles não sabiam como existiu isso, Corrêa, Japão. Isso é verdade? Isso não é uma história de internet? Peraí, gente, eu botei os vídeos, são públicos, das senhoras ainda vivas contando essa história. Eu não vou dar spoiler, não, porque isso também pode ser tema para o futuro, porque realmente é absolutamente incrível. E bom, eu vou só fechar aqui, porque eu tenho uma perguntinha, mas vou deixar por último. Memory laws are inseparable of transnational justice. Então, as leis da memória são inseparáveis de uma justiça transnacional. Ou seja, o Brasil não pode estar alienado disso, porque a gente está geograficamente longe. a- Olha só, nós fomos colonizados pelos portugueses, pelos holandeses no norte, no nordeste do Brasil. Eu tenho origem holandesa na minha família. Eu tenho a minha ascendência portuguesa e minha ascendência holandesa. Minha tataravó era holandesa.
Paraná?
Não, from
Mas no quê?
Pernambuco.
Pernambuco.
Ceará.
Ceará.
Ceará, exato. E, enfim, nós temos, se a gente for fazer um estudo genético, a gente vai descobrir que nós realmente, todos nós, temos a nossa ascendência num melting pot, né? Nós temos uma mistura, porque no Brasil os povos originários existiam aqui, claro que nós temos também nossos povos originários na nossa ascendência, mas nós fomos colonizados. E aí a gente esquece disso, esquece que o passado do Brasil não está só no Brasil, o passado do Brasil está lá na Europa. E se a gente quer compreender o Brasil de hoje, a gente tem que entender a Europa de ontem. E não só a Europa de ontem, mas também a Ásia, e também os Estados Unidos, e também o Canadá, e também todos os países que fazem parte de uma transnational justice, ou provocando aqueles que não fazem. Para a gente falar em democracy, né? Para a gente falar em democracia com memória, porque olha que tema fantástico, né? Memocracia. Eu achei aqui apaixonante. Professor Fábio, me desculpa ter me entusiasmado aqui, acho que eu nem vou fazer mais pergunta para deixar a palavra com o senhor.
Muito obrigado. Lúcia, não se preocupem, eu vou ser muito breve. Na verdade, eu tenho uma pergunta para o professor Uladzislau, professor Ulad, para os mais íntimos. Mas antes de mais nada, eu queria agradecer o convite formulado pelo desembargador e amigo desembargador André Andrade. Prazer estar aqui com a professora Lúcia Frota, recebendo, ouvindo o professor Ulad, cujo projeto de pesquisa eu conheço há uns 2, 3 anos, algo assim, né? Estivemos juntos aqui na EMERJ. Esse projeto Democracy, né? Desenvolvido pelo professor Ulad, vocês puderam ver, é um projeto interessantíssimo porque ele é muito amplo e diversificado, né? E ele é amplo, cobrindo uma série de países, sem ser superficial, né? Então, e acaba cobrindo uma série de temas, porque envolve leis de memória em cada país, e cada país tem as suas peculiaridades. Então, não necessariamente dialogam ou tratam do mesmo assunto, e ainda assim, o professor Ulad consegue se aprofundar sobre cada uma dessas realidades, ainda que os temas não sejam exatamente os mesmos. Então, o projeto Democracy Project é realmente um projeto bem interessante que foi apresentado há uns 2 anos pelo professor Ulad. Mas, em razão da adiantada hora, eu queria começar com a pergunta e depois, só um minuto no máximo, né, justificar a pergunta. A minha pergunta envolve um ponto muito pessoal, professor Lade, que é: qual é a sua avaliação pessoal a partir de tudo isso que você expôs? E eu estou falando aqui mais especificamente sobre essa legislação que limita ou que criminaliza não o revisionismo histórico, mas o negacionismo, né? É claro que podemos falar também de revisionismo histórico. No entanto, todos têm direito a uma opinião, mas não têm direito aos próprios fatos. Então é claro que aqui tem uma diferença. A gente sabe que vai ser mais difícil lidar com a questão do revisionismo histórico, porque a história se desenvolve a partir de revisões, né? Um caso clássico aqui é a Guerra do Paraguai. No início da história, a Guerra do Paraguai, o Brasil era um herói, havia uma narrativa. Depois vem uma narrativa mais marxista em relação à Guerra do Paraguai e o papel do Brasil nessa guerra, e depois agora tem uma revisão em torno disso, já tem uma terceira versão, digamos, mais intermediária sobre o papel do Brasil na Guerra do Paraguai. Isso só para dar um exemplo bobo, infantil, mas só para mostrar como a história depende de revisões. Então tem um certo risco aqui na limitação ao revisionismo histórico, mas eu nem estou falando do revisionismo, eu estou pensando mesmo na negação, no negacionismo. Eu queria saber qual é a sua avaliação a esse respeito, se é positiva, porém limitada ao Holocausto. Ela é positiva, mas entendendo como um bom precedente, né, algo que possa ser levado para outras situações não relacionadas ao Holocausto, ao antissemitismo, e especificamente ao Holocausto. Ah, Aqui no Brasil, alguém pode dizer que não houve um golpe de Estado, mas houve uma revolução, né? A rose by any other name, né? Enfim, como dizia Shakespeare, uma rosa chamada de qualquer outro nome continua tendo o mesmo cheiro. Então você pode dizer que o golpe foi uma revolução, mas continua sendo aquilo que aconteceu em 1964. Mas o ponto não é esse, ninguém nega esse fato, mas outras questões já seriam negar a tortura, o que é algo que acontece mesmo. Tem gente que diz, não aconteceu, não aconteceu, não aconteceu dessa forma. Bom, não aconteceu dessa forma, talvez já esteja mais próximo de um revisionismo, né? Mas há aqueles que negam que ocorreu a tortura, como é alegado. Então, até que ponto essa proibição do negacionismo do Holocausto é um precedente, e é um precedente bom ou é um precedente ruim se levado para outras situações? É algo que deve ser tailor-made, né? Feito sob medida para o Holocausto dos judeus, mas não deve ser um produto de exportação, não é um precedente que deve inspirar leis semelhantes para outros fatos, porque estaremos naquele slippery slope. Então, eventualmente, vamos acabar entrando num terreno perigoso em relação à limitação à liberdade de expressão. Então, em resumo, e pela adiantada hora, a minha pergunta é só essa, é só uma avaliação pessoal, né? A partir de tudo que você pesquisou, que é um material muito rico, qual é a sua opinião pessoal a esse respeito?
Thank you so much, Fabio, for the excellent question. Obviously, it's a difficult question, not only on the legal level in terms of how we can replicate, but on the more ethical and moral level. right? By no ways of trivializing or denying Holocaust, and I'm not saying it out of pure courtesy because we're talking in the legal systems, in the legal settings, excuse me. I think that it's very unpopular, since you're asking about my popular about my personal ideas about this. It's very unpopular idea, but I think back in the 80s, it was a huge mistake to criminalize Holocaust denialism. Again, it has nothing to do with the fact whether the Holocaust happened or not. I would even say for the Jewish history itself, because it also fortified to a vast degree this anti-Semitic argument, this idea that the Jews are running the world, and therefore you cannot even interpret the Jewish history in the first place. Again, I'm not claiming. Most of my colleagues are definitely disagreeing with me here. But what I want to say in this regard, and which might be even more important, and why when you are there is no way back. Now, under the current settings in Europe, decriminalizing Holocaust denialism would be even a bigger mistake, because that politically sends a signal, especially considering the complex events in Gaza and the rising anti-Semitism in Europe. And again, I'm not getting there into moral positions on Palestine or Israel. This is not the matter of the discussion. But with, outside that discussion, it sends a very strong claim that Holocaust is contestable. It's not longer foundational. In this way, each time I'm abroad and I'm consulted, let's say somewhere in Asia, whether we should adopt something similar and replicate because the Germanic model seems so progressive and emancipating in the self-expulsory memory law. I'm always saying that even self-expulsory memory laws are quite dangerous animals. And they're not only dangerous because it's very rare that we can agree on historical facts and separate facts from opinions. So to do this mental exercise that any specialist in freedom of expression is trained to do, like separating facts from opinions and saying that there is a certain level and facts deserve the protection, while opinions are vice versa. Opinions deserve the protection why facts, if it's established facts, it cannot be contested. Otherwise, it's similar to the defamation. I'm just finding many other ways of contesting history and this sense of loss, offense, and trauma, both through non-punitive legislation in general, through educative policies, but also through defamation laws whenever needed. And I'm thinking as soon as we are putting something like Holocaust denials, but for another historical event, we're not only opening the Pandora box, we are creating the situation that, in a certain period of time, decriminalizing that will send the wrong signal. Let me give you an example about Armenian genocide. So France attempted to replicate this legislation also for the events that happened in the Ottoman Turkey and the beginning of the 20th century, and then removed it, so effectively decriminalized it. And many other countries had to do the same after the very contradictory decision of the European Court of Human Rights in the Permanente case, which was about a member of the Turkish Labour Party going to Switzerland and manifesting or reinterpreting Armenian genocide denial as not genocidal, but as local events and nothing more. And well, he happily returns to Turkey. Switzerland starts a case against him. The case gets to the European Court of Human Rights, to the Grand Chamber, and then the judges are super divided. It's still one of the most controversial decisions in the past 20 years of the European Court of Human Rights. And the final verdict, both in the lower and the Grand Chambers, for different reasons, it's a bit of a different justification, is that freedom of expression should be sustained. But you see the signal it sends. Obviously, Turkish diplomacy and Azeri, considering their Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian contestation between Azerbaijan and Armenia, they both reinterpreted immediately as, wait a minute, European Court of Human Rights is with us. Even they are telling that it's not exactly genocide. Whereas several judges of the European Court of Human Rights even had to issue the dissenting or concurring opinions where they're kind of saying, even if they are supporting this judgment, and the majority were by no means denying the Armenian genocide, is the established facts. But what I'm saying is that I think it's completely impossible to avoid memory loss, at least at the declaratory level. Of course, the very easy on the surface conclusion is that perhaps memory loss of self inculpatory nature, like we committed as the nation or our governments, terrible crimes against humanity, against minorities, against other nations, are preferable in comparison to those self-exculpatory. They were the baddest, we were the goodest. But I would say that the devil is still in punitivity. And this is the dangerous zone that as soon as you corrupt certain version of history, not only through constitutional law, through educational policies, but also civil policies, sometimes civil code can be also instrumental there, but go one step further and engage criminal law, there is no way back. And if you're getting that step back, I'm afraid you might be sending a signal for the good or for the wrong reason. Yeah, so that's probably my answer.
Very good, professor. O nosso diretor-geral, o desembargador Cláudio Delorto, informou que, infelizmente, ele não vai conseguir estar aqui nos encerrando aqui nosso evento, e também o desembargador André Gustavo Corrêa de Andrade teve que se ausentar neste momento. Mas eu acho que ficou absolutamente claro que o tema ele é extensível para outros eventos, a gente não tem como finalizar. A história, ela, na verdade, cada vez que é revista, reestudada, ela merece aí um debate e merece uma interface mais técnica. Eu vou colocar aqui um ponto só que, na verdade, eu assistindo os outros eventos também, imaginando que a nossa plateia aqui não tenha assistido, eu gostaria de colocar para o professor Uladzislau, mas, professor, por favor, não se sinta obrigado a exaurir isso aqui, até porque não há mais tempo, é só uma catapulta para que a gente possa depois ter novos eventos em continuidade. Considerando que o Brasil não utiliza memory laws punitivas, né? Leis da memória punitivas, mas atua por políticas públicas, como a Comissão da Verdade e a própria jurisprudência constitucional, será que nós podemos considerar que o Brasil tem um modelo próprio, distinto da Europa, mnemônico, né, de mnemonic constitutionalism, que é um modelo próprio de constitucionalismo mnemônico, ou de constitucionalização da memória? Does Brazil has its own model of constitutionalized memory or no? What do you think?
The short answer is yes.
Yes.
Just if I could just a couple of words there. I tried not to separate you from your lunch and coffee. Look, I not only yes, but also it's a fascinating mnemonic constitutionalism, not only because, as in many other countries in the region, is heavily based on transitional justice and military dictatorship is so important there, and the colonialism is also, this invisible shadow behind, and one day I think it will be super explosive in terms of soft or punitive memory laws. That remains to be seen. But I wanted to mention just one thing, and why I find the Brazilian mnemonic constitutionalism an interesting model, because it shifts to the idea that slavery as the phenomenon is not necessarily we are talking about, back in towards the beginning of the 19th century when the slavery was contested and gradually removed. Yeah, right. It's about modern slavery and integrating most recent memories of the 20th and even beginning of the 21st century with the, this kind of justicia de verdade that happens more recently, and yet has something to do ancestrally, genetically, with the slavery in Brazil in the throughout 18th, 19th century. And I'm talking here about contestation with Volkswagen in particular. There's recent cases from the north of Brazil talking about transitional memory, but of the imposition that a modern corporation, moreover, European corporation, can be engaged in the crimes against humanity, in particular slavery, here in Brazil, modern slavery. Moreover, that slavery is genetically kind of constructed from people who are already in the in certain pejorative positions historically, and therefore they're easily enslaved in that region. And demanding both symbolic recognition, because Volkswagen came up twice with apologies, as we know, right? And if I remember, that was also part of the judicial dictum of one of the higher courts in the respective state in the north of Brazil. So it's kind of crafting its own version of the symbolism, into this through apologies. Remember this Dutch king going to, like most recently in Suriname, but also making this public apology that is essentially symbolic memory law published on the website and can be referred to. Also another case that comes to my mind is in the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which is extremely interesting. I think this is something that we in Europe should learn from Latin Americans, because Latin American mechanism, unlike our European Convention of Human Rights on the level of the Council of Europe, also permits to charge apologies and symbolic actions in terms of restitution, reparation, which is the mechanism that is in a certain way richer than what we have in Europe. And one of the cases there was also from Brazil, and it's also about the context of kind of modern slavery, but intertwined and interpreted historically. And that leads me to finalize the answer that not only yes, but it's the model that awaits, I would say, at least its doctoral dissertation and several monographs. And as much as we rediscovered the tragic past of Brazil in the 70s, 80s through Ainda, Estou, Aqui, I think that this is the page that, with that we in Europe and elsewhere in the world would need to learn about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. Muito obrigada, professor. É uma aula cada vez que ele expõe, né? Thank you very much. Muito obrigada. E aí, finalizando aqui, tentando dar uma costurazinha, só com o tema do nosso, uma escolha muito feliz, ainda estou aqui, né? E com a finalização do nosso evento, eu tinha colocado aqui, né, que estamos numa escola, we are in a school of judge, so I put every decision is an act of permanence, we are still here. Então, cada decisão do juiz é um ato de permanência, que estamos na escola do juiz, mas eu acho que cabe melhor aqui hoje que cada palestra, cada evento é um ato de permanência. E hoje nós permanecemos, então ainda estamos aqui. Mas queremos convidar o professor Uladzislau para continuar essa conversa about democracy, né, professor Fábio? Vamos continuar isso em 2026? Então, já estão todos convidados, a gente só vai marcar na agenda. Muito obrigada, obrigada pela presença de todos, até a próxima.
Boa pergunta, final, genial.